Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see so many people here on a beautiful sunny afternoon when it looks like spring is starting to arrive. My name's Hal Roth. I direct the Contemplative Studies program here at Brown. And I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the program and begin by thanking the person who really makes all of our events flow, Ann Hireman Hart. Since the fall of 2005, Contemplative Studies has organized 157 different lectures, workshops, the occasional video, the occasional concert, and the very first one that we organized was given by Dr. Amishi Jha. At that time, she was a young and up-and-coming cognitive scientist at the University of Pennsylvania who was doing some very interesting and kind of out-of-the-box stuff in studying meditation and mindfulness, something that is still not necessarily appreciated widely through the scientific fields in which she has engaged over the years. And then on our 10th anniversary in 2015, she also came back and lectured for us almost to the day, the 10th anniversary of her first lecture. And now she's here today. She's now an associate professor at the University of Miami and is leading one of the most ambitious and interesting research programs in the field of cognitive science of meditation in the entire country. So if you're interested in perhaps looking at a graduate program in cognitive science or psychology that is working with mindfulness and meditation, please consider Dr. Jha's program. Contemplative Studies also has developed quite a bit since the early days, back in, well, almost pre-2005. And as many of you know, we are now in official undergraduate concentration, and we have currently 25 concentrators. Not a lot for departments that occupy this building, but quite a bit, especially given where we started. We look at, in contemplative studies, we look at contemplative experience both within its cultural context, cultural, historical, philosophical, religious context, or non-religious context. We also deal with contemplative experience through scientific evaluation, and we also encourage students to develop critical first-person engagement with those contemplative practices which we teach in the classroom, so that these are not simply abstract topics of study. These can be directly related to the lives of our students. So, Dr. Amishi Jha graduated, did her PhD at UC Davis. Did you work with Cliff? No. In 1998, and has held positions at University of Pennsylvania, University of Miami. In many ways, she is a pioneer in the cognitive science of meditation. And as most of you know, this is actually the third time we've scheduled Dr. Jha's lecture. This is, we had one scheduled in October, and she actually made it here, but she had to turn back because of the hurricane that was bearing down on University of Miami grounds and on her fMRI machine and her family. And then she was going to come in February, but her flight was canceled because of an impending blizzard. So very fortunately today, scheduled in April, there was probably not too much weather-wise that could go wrong. So third time's the charm. It's been a real pleasure to get to know Amishi over the years. We were co-chairs of the Third International Symposium on Contemplative Studies and worked incredibly well together. For that, we organized and ran about 35 or 40 telephone meetings of an hour, hour and a half. And it was a joy to work with Amishi because she has a similar bizarre sense of humor. So please join me in giving a warm brown welcome to Dr. Amishi Jha.
Thank you. All right. So yes, finally we've made it. I hope. If I can get through this lecture, that third time will be a charm. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here. I actually wanted to ask, I don't know what button do I press to get this podium mic. I think I've muted it. Hopefully it won't have any problems. Everybody can see me okay? Yeah. Yeah, it's great to be here. I have been a fan of Brown's Contemplative Studies program since its inception in, I guess, 2005. And feel so grateful to have the opportunity to come present to you. I had a great meeting with undergrads earlier today. Got to learn about all the big grants that are happening, all the exciting stuff at the medical school. So it's been a wonderful time to be here. And what I want to do today is actually share with you some of the work we've been doing over the last 5 or 6 years or so on this topic, as stated in the title slide here, looking at how to build cognitive resilience in high-stress cohorts with mindfulness training. But I thought we should probably begin by me giving you a sense of kind of my perspective and what kind of orientation I take toward this topic, since it's a pretty broad topic. And let's see, how do I advance this? It's not working from there. Let's do this. Okay. So my research program, so I'm formally trained as a cognitive neuroscientist interested in how the brain pays attention. And most of the training I've had and most of the work in my own lab focused for many years on just the basic mechanisms of attention, how we can look at different brain structures and brain processes that are tied to the brain's attention system. So we use functional MRI, brainwave recordings, and behavioral studies. But after doing this for several years, it became clear to me that that's sort of not enough to sustain my interest, because though we know that attention is a very powerful brain system that can influence virtually everything we do, it's quite fragile. And I became very interested in understanding what the nature of this fragility is and what aspects of attention become so vulnerable. And some of the kind of main contenders were stress, negative mood, and threat. And when people experience these kind of three main factors and others, their attention declines and diminishes. And so after establishing that and understanding the nature of that, I wanted to figure out if there's a way to actually bolster attention, to protect it, so that in the face of stress, poor mood, and threat, we may be able to keep our attentional functioning going strong in the face of that. And that's what led me to my work in mindfulness training. It really was as a way to see how we might offer people a low-tech, very accessible form of training that they could do on a regular basis to keep their attention system strong. And so as you'll see, I know that the topic of mindfulness is very broad. I know you've had some wonderful speakers that really span the whole field of contemplative studies and really of mindfulness practice. But this is the lens that I'll take in the work that I'll share with you today. And I'm the only one up here, but I wanted to just give a quick shout out to my lab, because there's a lot of people that are involved in this work, and I'm very grateful for all of them and their ability to allow me to share with you the work that we'll do today. I also want to thank our funders. Most of the active grants that we have right now are actually supported by the Department of Defense. So just wanted to thank them. And our advisors. So as we'll end tonight, I will tell you about some of the work we're doing on our most recent set of studies that involves a collaboration with active duty military. So a lot of our advisors are active duty personnel who have an interest in mindfulness training, but are also very keen on understanding how we can bring it into to help their communities. So I've tried my best to assemble a team that has expertise in both the mindfulness side as well as the military side, so we can really engage in best practices for delivery. All right, so what do I want to focus on today? Really three main questions. The first is, what are the costs of high stress intervals on attention? What does it do to our attention? And, as I already kind of suggested, is there some way in which mindfulness training could help us, could help the attention system? And if we're going to offer mindfulness training, and we're working with high stress populations, how might we be sure that we're engaging in best practices, which for those groups may mean low dose, low time demand forms of training that they can engage in even though they're under these high stress contexts. All right, now what time is it already? It's 5:44. You guys have made it through your work day and you're here, so I'm going to give you the take-home message. I like to do this really because I know, I study attention, I know how it can wander. So this is not an invitation to mind wander, but I do want to give you a sense of kind of the final destination for the journey of this talk so you know where we're going to land. So what I will tell you, what we will discuss through this presentation is that attention declines over high stress intervals. That's what we see, most reliable. And that mindfulness training is protective. We can offer them training so that they are protected against this decline. But the key, especially if we're going to offer short-form mindfulness training, is that practice, the engagement of practice, is best supported and fully engaged in for them to see benefits. So that's where we're going. But again, please stay with me if possible. So the common theme for all of the different groups that we work with is this. Really, we're talking about populations for whom stress is a big deal and a part of life and a part of how they operate. And stress is a pretty big topic. When I use that term, I'm talking about this perceived sense of overwhelm, that the demands on you far exceed what's comfortable for you to do. It's accompanied by a sense of dysphoria, that everything's not okay, and kind of a distractibility, a preoccupation with the demands upon you. Anybody ever experienced this? It's a part of all of our lives, really, and as we'll see in a moment, I mean, many of the communities that I'm very interested in working with are academic communities, so really us. So we know a lot about stress, and again, my window in is going to be with regard to attention and performance. But one of the kind of classic ways that people have talked about the relationship between stress and performance is described in this function, the Yerkes-Dodson function. Maybe many of you are kind of familiar with this function, but I want to just talk you through it. So essentially, this inverted U shape is talking about how much the magnitude of stress you experience impacts the success of your performance. And there's a certain amount of stress that we would consider sort of activating, right, igniting, that gets us kind of jazzed up to do what we want to do. That leads to, to a certain amount of time, for a certain period of time and a certain degree of stress, really improving our performance. And in that case, we'd put the letters EU in front of the word stress, so it's eustress, right? But after some level of stress, we're going to reach a tipping point. And after that, it's no longer comfortable, it's no longer activating, it's actually problematic. When we get into that range is what we might refer to it as distress. So, the downward part of this inverted U shape is where, unfortunately, a lot of the groups that I'm working with sit. And it's bad because of the kind of psychological experience it gives us and that it challenges our sense of well-being. But it's particularly problematic because it negatively impacts our performance. And to give you a sense of the kind of costs of this, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I wanted to just share this. This is a photo montage done, a photo collage done as actually was a kind of an artistic project of soldiers just taking pictures of their faces during various points in their deployment cycle. So we've got them at pre-deployment, during deployment, and post-deployment. So just kind of lay your eyes on what you see there. And I think this St. Jerome quote kind of captures in my mind what we're talking about, right? The face is the mirror of the mind. The eyes, without speaking, confess the secrets of the heart. And I think most of you would agree that it's not a pretty picture, so to speak. Putting people through high stress circumstances is something we can see on their face. We can see it on our own faces. And unfortunately for these groups, it's not just a one-time deal. Most of the units of active duty military that we've worked with are not simply going through one cycle of pre-deployment training, deployment, and post-deployment, but on an average of about 3 to 5 as the range, the median range in which our participants find themselves. So imagine this picture over successive deployments. So how can we best protect individuals that are going through some kind of cyclical stress cycle? That's the broadest question that I'm interested in exploring. And I think that with regard to the impact of high stress on well-being, there's a lot more that's known. So here I'm just showing sort of a cartoon image where we've got some starting point of a high stress interval, what I'm calling time 1, the point at which we're going to index the beginning of some constrained period of time, from a few to several months, over which they're experiencing protracted demand and the subjective experience of stress. And then time 2 is when they're indexed again after, like I said, a couple of months, let's say 8 weeks later. And if we look at most folks during their kind of normative life, like typical civilian life, and we tracked their well-being, sure, there'd be our little ups and downs, but we kind of end up being in this kind of dotted line, normative level of well-being. We're relatively stable. But if we look at people that are undergoing definable periods of high stress, it's not normative, it's not steady state. It actually is a significant and predictable decline in their well-being. That's probably no surprise, right? If you've been through a period of stress yourself, it's like, yeah, you feel pretty bad by the end of the period of time that we're talking about. Now, as a researcher, for most of us, it's hard to necessarily know when we're going to experience a high demand interval, because they kind of come at us maybe with some surprise in our lives. But for many groups and for many contexts in our society, there is a predictable cycle of stress. And that's where it becomes a good opportunity as a researcher to partner with those types of individuals, because we can see that the level of demand is going to increase, and through many research studies that their well-being declines predictably. Right? So the kind of groups that I'm talking about are students over the course of the academic semester, in particular the second half of the academic semester. There's a lot of existing research that shows that over that second part of the semester, as you approach finals, which, are we there yet? We're kind of coming close, I guess, final season, that well-being is reduced, stress levels increase, there are poorer food choices made, and riskier behaviors in general. So those are all part of what's known in this cyclical cycle of the academic semester. Same thing goes for athletes, actually, student athletes at the college level. That pre-season training, the season itself, but pre-season training can be a period of time where most student athletes are going through academic demands, but they're also intensively physically training for the season ahead. So another very predictable time period in which well-being can decline. And then, of course, probably the most salient example, as I showed you from the last slide, was military personnel. And for them, it's not a single period of high demand. The high demand intervals can actually be the pre-deployment period itself, when they're preparing to go, deployment, when they're actually in this combat context for most of them, and even post-deployment as they're reintegrating into civilian life. So this is sort of the set of groups that I'd like to share with you today. We work with many other groups, so first responders, firefighters we work with. We even work with CPAs during the tax season and pre-tax season. You can think of, now that I've mentioned this, many groups in which this might be the case. We're actually about to start a project with a cancer center, because for many people, the diagnosis of cancer and then the protracted treatment can be a high stress, high demand interval in which we know that there's going to be a downward decline in their overall sense of well-being as they're getting the treatment. So I'm going to just constrain my conversation together today on these three groups, and let's see if I'm able to get through all of them, what I want to share with you. So going back to what I said at the outset, attention is a big part of what I study. And for all three of these groups, you can imagine that attention may be important, right? For students, for sure, in the context of learning. For athletes, not only for learning, but also in the context of their athletic performance. If you, for example, one project I'll tell you about was with the football team. If you don't have your eye on the ball, things aren't going to go so well. If you don't know what the other players are doing, not going to go so well. But even in individual sports, my daughter's a gymnast, attention matters for performance. And in the military context, not only does attention matter, but in many cases, the consequences can be life or death for the participants, meaning the soldiers themselves, or for the people with whom they're interfacing. So that's just to say that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about attention, which I'm describing as really one aspect of attention, selective attention, or kind of formally described as the attentional orienting system. I'm going to use the metaphor of a flashlight, right? So if you're in a darkened room and you shine a flashlight on a particular location, we know that our processing of that part of space is going to be selectively advantaged because the flashlight's shining there. And attention works in a very similar fashion. Where we direct our attention is benefited by our computational processing resources, better able to handle what happens where we pay attention. But sort of the close cousin, or the kind of, close cousin of the attention system is something called working memory. And working memory I think about as this sort of whiteboard here. I call it sort of the mental whiteboard. It's our internally held mental scratch space. And you can think of it as a whiteboard with disappearing ink. So it's very time constrained. Working memory is the ability to maintain and manipulate information over just a few to several seconds. So think about the last time you were in a conversation and you were listening, but you had your point that you wanted to make, right? And you're kind of holding that point in your head. You just exercised your working memory in order to do that. Or, I used to say in the olden days, like, imagine yourself hearing a phone number and then walking over to the phone to dial it. Nobody does that anymore, so it's kind of dated example, right? I don't know any phone number, seriously, I have no idea. My own spouse's phone number, maybe I'd remember. But so the point is that working memory and attention both share this feature of being very important for our moment-to-moment processing of what's happening. And they allow us, as they work together, to do complex, what we call higher order cognitive functions, right? Planning, communicating, learning, our ability to regulate our emotions, in some sense, also rely on these key cognitive systems, as well as decision-making and the ability to guide our behavior and control our behavior. So this is to say that these are very, what I'd call proximal effects. They're very kind of core systems, the workhorse systems of cognition that are important for so many different things. And if we're able to use something like mindfulness training to bolster their functioning, that could be very powerfully beneficial to people, especially as they're experiencing high stress. Does that make sense? Okay. So I just want to make the parallel that though we know a lot about the costs of high stress on well-being, we actually don't know all that much with regard to attention. But we'd have the similar set of predictions, right? That if you have some period of time over which people are experiencing high demand, and relative to normative, kind of normal circumstances, you predict that their attention may decline. Why is that? Because the nature of what makes it high demand actually may involve the continued use and maybe even the overuse of our attention. Right? There may be, think about again the student example. There's a lot of demand on you to study, to make sure that you're getting your assignments in on time. So you're kind of using up in some sense these resources that are available, so there may be fewer available at the end of the interval versus the beginning of the interval. That's the sort of prediction. And if this is the case, if it is the case that high stress intervals deplete attention, then our question would be, can we provide some kind of training that would promote resilience in this context? Or as I describe it, really cognitive resilience, because I'm again focusing in on this cognitive capacity. So I want to just describe or define the way I think about what cognitive resilience is. So it's the ability to maintain or regain cognitive capacities at risk of degradation, depletion, or failure in the face of situational challenges, as well as that are really experienced over protracted time periods. Right? So it's a long period of time and your attention's vulnerable. It's going to decline. So the opposite of having a declining, debilitated attention system is one that could actually bounce back or maintain its functioning even in the face of those stressors. Or to put it sort of visually, we'd want to provide training that even though they're experiencing high stress, mental training that could keep attention level over time. And if we're really lucky, maybe we could actually offer training so that even if they're experiencing high stress, even potentially traumatic, stressful events, they may be able to engage in a training in a way that, remember back to the Yerkes-Dodson function, that doesn't leave them in this distress portion, but actually may even move them over so they're able to function and perform at a high level, even if they're experiencing high demand. So maybe we can promote flourishing, or what some soldiers really refer to as post-traumatic growth. It's not that they didn't experience the stress, but there's a way in which those experiences can bolster their success instead of completely debilitating them and leading to disorder. So what would that require? Well, the prediction is that if you did nothing at all, they're going to decline. Maybe if they did some kind of average amount of engagement in your program, you could keep them steady. But if they potentially really committed to the practice exercises that are offered as part of this program, maybe they could even improve over the same period of time. That's at least our aspiration. Maybe this is possible. And maybe implicit in all of this is sort of like a physical fitness analogy, right? We know with physical fitness, nobody's going to think that if you know about physical fitness, you'll be physically fit. Nobody thinks that. It's like, yeah, that's not. Just knowing how to exercise doesn't help you be fit. But engaging in the practice will. So if you do the practice, you'll benefit. And the more you do, the more you may benefit. And the same notion would be here for mental training. And of course, the mental training that I'm most interested in exploring is mindfulness training. So let me just describe again mindfulness in the kind of way that I think about it. And I'm giving you sort of the description here and a metaphor, again, to think about it. So mindfulness is a mental mode characterized by attention to present moment experience without conceptual elaboration or emotional reactivity, right? Or if you think of the mind as this mentally traveling kind of machine that we walk around with, when we think about mindfulness, we're not in reverse, thinking about the past. We're not in fast forward, planning for the future, but the button is right on play. We are fully experiencing the moment-to-moment unfolding of our lives in real time as it's happening. And we're taking a particular orientation toward that experience. That's non-conceptual and non-reactive. Does that jive with what most of you, since I'm not the first mindfulness speaker you've ever heard? So, that's kind of the way that we think about what mindfulness is, and that's the mental training that we want to provide to see if it's protective for these people in high-stress circumstances over multiple weeks. Now, like I mentioned, we've had the opportunity to work with some pretty unusual and, I think, compelling groups, just because of the nature of their demands. And one of the things that happens in many times when I've secured a grant funding and now I want to go engage in the project, is I have to talk to the leadership, and I have to basically make my case for why they should allow me access to their groups, whether it's the dean to get access to students, or the coach to get access to football players, or a general to get access to soldiers. They all want to know, like, before I give you time, even though you've got this funded research project, NIH or DOD may think your project's of value, but you got to convince me, because I'm the one that's going to even allow you to talk to my folks. And I think that's actually reasonable, because we don't want to waste anybody's time. So the question that they ask in a kind of more plain terms is, like, does it work? And I think that it's, like I said, a fair question. But it's actually, even though it looks quite simple, it's a complicated question. And I want to just take us through the logic that I use and what I say to these people, because hopefully it'll give you a sense of kind of the way that I've been thinking about it, and also kind of what has been successful in getting access to a lot of different kinds of groups. So does it work? I mean, the first thing is, well, what do we mean by it? Right? If we went around the room and I said, okay, tell me what mindfulness training is, we might have lots of different answers to what that really means, what it looks like, what the particular delivery model is, etc. And it's absolutely the case that now, with the kind of popular exponential increase in mindfulness training's availability, there are so many resources in which people can, which people can access. So if you say, does it work? Well, what do you mean by it? Is it a book you read? Or, does this workshop count as getting a mindfulness training? Or did you use an app, or did you go on retreat? Just to make clear that, I don't have an answer for every particular variant. What we have answers on are really the ones that are most well studied, which are manualized programs on which research projects can be conducted. So when we think about it, we're really, my authority, what I can say with authority and confidence is going to be very constrained to a particular set of things that's been studied, right? And even if we look within the world of manualized programs, even that becomes sort of a world in and of itself, right? So if we think about mindfulness training programs, they vary along various dimensions. They vary along how long they actually are, right? So programs could be 8 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 weeks, a day, a weekend. It could be many different delivery structures. And then even within these periods of time, let's say it's 8 weeks, how many hours of time are you requiring per week? So 40 plus hours, or less than that. A second aspect, in addition to duration, that has to do with the it in does it work, is really what is it that's the content of the mindfulness training program? Is it going to primarily focus mindfulness exercises in which you can actually sit together, do practices, and discuss the experience of doing the practices as you're introduced to them? Or is it a lot of didactic information about sort of the downside of stress or the benefits of mindfulness or the particular use of mindfulness in various contexts? And then finally, another aspect of these programs is who is delivering it and what is the best way in which it might be scaled up to offer more people. What is the expertise of the person offering the training? Is this person have a lot of personal, embodied, first-person experience of mindfulness by being a practitioner? Or potentially, do they have a lot of expertise around the context or the community with which they're working? So this is just throwing up some ideas of the complexity of this does it work question, right? And I want to just say a few things about probably the most well-studied, not probably, the most well-studied programs. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, so Jon Kabat-Zinn, who we just had visited recently, and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Both are programs that kind of fit these parameters, right? They're around 8 weeks in duration, typically about 2 to 3 hours a week, including an all-day retreat, so around 40 plus hours of time. They typically have both mindfulness exercises and didactic information in them. And the trainers are kind of selected and certified in a way that says that they have had a lot of first-person experience in the content of what it means to be a mindfulness practitioner before they're to deliver it to others. And when we constrain it in this way, now I have some way to say, okay, this is what I mean by does it work. It's this particular set of features with which I can say, okay, yes, I can tell you a little bit about the research done on this, which leads us to the sort of second part of this question. What do we mean for something to work? Right? What does that mean? Because I can imagine it could mean very different things to for different populations. And when I think of it, and actually this has been paralleling the way in which the research has been conducted, the broadest way I think of something being helpful or working is, does it reduce suffering, right? And that suffering can take many different forms. It can be suffering in the body, whether it's various physical ailments or physical disorders, right? And the range of things, of disorders in which mindfulness training has been applied is quite broad. From rheumatoid arthritis to high blood pressure to chronic pain, right? Those are pretty broad, or in the context of cancer treatment, the physical pain associated with that. Or we can think about suffering in the mind, psychological disorders like anxiety, depression, PTSD, ADHD, all of which are categories of suffering within the mind. And probably a newer area within the mindfulness training literature is the impact of mindfulness training on relationships. So whether that's the family dynamics, of marital relationships, child-parent relationships, or workplace settings. How do people get along as a function of engaging in mindfulness training? So, as I said, the kind of research literature now is really triangulating on these aspects of how mindfulness training has its effects. And now after, 25 or so years, with the real exponential rise in the literature over the last 5 or 10, maybe 7 years at the most, we can start saying something about this, because people are going from basic studies, individual studies, to now conducting meta-analyses where they're aggregating across a lot of studies to figure out what is it that's beneficial versus not. And some of the recent ones have been large number of trials, 115 randomized trials, over 8,000 patients that focus primarily on MBSR and MBCT. And what do they say? Well, they're saying that yes, there are benefits when you compare mindfulness training of these two types of programs compared to treatment as usual or weightless control, and in some cases even an active comparison. And there's a whole host of benefits that have been systematically reported, right? So depression, anxiety, stress, etc. And the Journal of the American Medical Association similarly did a meta-analysis, and they also concluded, just to be clear, they're not saying this is like the best thing ever. They're saying the effects are moderate. They're not like mind-blowingly large, they're moderate. But what they say about it is that the magnitude of those effects is comparable with what would be the benefit if you had, it would be similar to the benefit of having a antidepressant in a primary care context. So to me, that means something. That means that they're translating in a way that says it's in some sense comparable to what might happen through certain psychopharmacologic solutions for some types of populations. So, does it work? Yes. Now, I hope you have a degree of skepticism about this, because I certainly did as a researcher, right? So let me just give you some context here. So how many of you would say that physical exercise is tied to physical well-being? Is there anybody that says that that's not the case? Right. It's like, why are you asking us such a stupid question? Right? It's our cultural understanding that physical exercise is tied to physical well-being. We know that. Our public health officials can give us guidance on it. And my argument would be that a research literature allowed us to get to that point of cultural understanding. Over the last 25 years, the number of research articles published that examines the relationship between physical exercise and physical well-being, 300,000 articles. That's a big number. So even though the mindfulness literature is growing, you know, the last meta-analysis I just showed you, 115 studies. So we are just at the beginning. And in addition to just being at the beginning, to be able to boldly conclude this, there is a problem that our dear literature is suffering from, right? And I like this description of it: the power of positive thinking skews mindfulness studies. I don't know if other people have described this, but essentially what's happening is that there's a file drawer effect. So that there is so much momentum around the positive benefits of mindfulness training that what we're seeing is that there's an overrepresentation of their success in the literature relative to what would be predicted for any new therapeutic treatment, which means that it's skewed. And I guess I want to say this because, you know, regardless of how much I love mindfulness training, first and foremost, I want to make sure as a researcher that I'm being a honest broker and making sure that all of the people that I speak to are being solid consumers of the information available. So, you know, mindfulness, though it is growing in its popularity, it's also suffering from a big media hype problem. And I think this kind of gives you the example of what's happening. So I'm going to revise my answer to does it work to a highly provisional yes, and I would say I could even make the font size for the yes a little bit smaller. Because I think that this is very much preliminary and at the beginning of research. And I'm very happy that some of the top researchers to delve into this area of effectiveness and doing the next sort of generation of meta-analyses are in the audience. So I think that more good science is coming, but I think we're just at the beginning. But having said all that, I mean, I don't think it's a complete waste of time. I don't think that we're completely making up the benefits of mindfulness. And I do think that when I talk to these leaders of different organizations, I can say that the results are looking quite positive. In fact, they're the whole reason I was able to secure the funding to check it out, right? But my interest as a researcher, actually I'm not a clinician, I'm a neuroscientist. My interest as a researcher doesn't necessarily come from does it work, which I'm going to lean on the clinical expertise to inform that. It really is how does it work? Because again, as attention being my focus and my interest, I want to understand how engaging in practices like the suite of practices offered in mindfulness training studies, how that actually may instantiate itself to the kind of broad range of benefits that we see. It's kind of amazing. There's not too many other treatments or modalities of training in which you'd expect, oh yeah, it's going to reduce the symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis and you might get a better relationship out of it. That's a pretty broad range, right? So something is happening more fundamentally, maybe even more proximally, that is common to all of these different beneficial effects that I'm very curious to understand. And in order to understand that, I have to look again at what is it that is happening in these training programs. We kind of gave you the broad range of the criteria that we might look at. But what is happening in the actual training offered? So really, we have to go back and look at what are the kind of foundational practices offered. And one of the foundational practices offered in every mindfulness training program I've ever heard of is mindfulness of breathing, right? It's an aspect of a stillness practice. There are others, but it's a stillness practice in which you guide people to focus their attention on some aspect of their breath. And I want to kind of go through this because, again, coming from a cognitive training perspective, this practice allows us to make predictions about what kind of changes we might expect in cognitive functioning and attentional functioning. So let's just go through it. So the instruction would be sit in a comfortable, alert, upright posture. Focus all of your attention to the sensations of breathing, right? We're saying the breath is the focus here. And you might pick what's most prominent to you. It can be described in many ways, but really it's about attention and the breath. And the further, next step of the practice instruction is to select some aspect of the practice, of the breath, that you can focus in on, a particular set of sensations. So it could be the coolness of air moving in and out of your nostrils, or your shoulders moving up and down, or your belly. But in addition to selecting what that sensation is, the next step is, well, maintain your focus there. It's not, for most of these foundational practices, it's not like skip around to whatever is most prominent. It's like pick it, anchor there, and that's where you're going to, for the formal period of time you're going to do this, hold that as sort of the target object for your practice. And of course, for any of us that have done this, the mind is a mind of its own, and this is part of the practice. If you notice that your mind has wandered away from this selected focus, return it back. So I'm highlighting these aspects because they are part of this sort of component processes that are part of the mindfulness of breathing exercise. Select and maintain, notice, and when you've mind wandered, return your attention. And my thinking going into this was essentially this is describing, and it comes through this practice and many others, circuit training for attention. Circuit training with regard to selection, holding focus there, working memory, and an awareness of what's happening in the mind, meta-awareness, and then control over mind wandering. So when I saw this, and beginning to understand how this might lead to the set of predictions we have, I think it becomes pretty straightforward of what you'd predict. If it really is circuit training for attention, then attention should be stronger as a function of doing it. So these would be our predictions. If we gave people cognitive tasks that tap into these component brain processes, we would predict that there would be improvement. So we'd predict better selective attention, better working memory, and potentially less mind wandering that happens if you do this over and over again. Now, my window in, at least in the studies that I'll share with you today, is cognitive tasks. Other people have, and even if I came and give a different lecture, might talk about the brain processes that support these. But really at this point, I'm interested in seeing what are the functional consequences with regard to performance if people engage in mindfulness practice. Are these hypotheses actually supported? And thankfully, we're at a point in the literature where we're starting to amass a lot of positive support. There's been, not as many as 300,000 yet, but many studies that are finding, and this is even a little bit dated, but finding benefits of selective attention and working memory with people engaging in mindfulness practice. And we've done recently we did our own review of this in a paper that I published with some colleagues in American Psychologists. So if you want more like up to the minute, up to the 2 years ago review, you can read the American Psychologist article. So that was kind of encouraging that those predictions weren't completely off the wall, that if you do these practices over and over again, just like if you were training for a marathon and you ran every day, you'd expect better performance on your run score, your run time. We find something similar. But one area that probably hasn't been studied all that much is mind wandering. And we're just starting to now understand even how to go about studying mind wandering, both from the brain science side as well as the performance side. So that's what I'd like to share with you today, if you're up for it, is what is it that we see with regard to mind wandering and mindfulness training. Now, the other reason I think mind wandering is so important for the groups that I'm working with is because, again, if your mind wanders, there are going to be consequences to your performance. At least that's our prediction. And for groups who are experiencing high stress, but also have to perform well, this could actually be dire. Whether it's a student missing what's being said during a lecture or can't get through reading an article, or studying for an exam or even dedicating themselves to write a paper because of their own mind wandering, if there's some way we can help curb this or tame the wandering mind, maybe there's a way in which we can benefit their performance and hopefully their well-being as well. So that's what I'd like to share with you today. And I want to just make clear what I mean when I use that term mind wandering. Right? It's kind of a broad term. We had a good discussion about it over lunch today. So mind wandering, I'm constraining to mean having off-task thoughts during an ongoing task or activity. Right? So you want to be doing something, you want your attention to be on the thing you're doing, but it's not. It's being hijacked or kind of pushed away because it's preoccupied with internal mental content. And what we know happens when people mind wander under those circumstances is that they have difficulty performing the task at hand. They can't do it as well. performance errors, the sense of distractibility, and something called perceptual decoupling, which we've just started examining in my own lab. Perceptual decoupling is essentially our ability to perceive information that's happening within a few hundred milliseconds of an image hitting the retina, for example, is actually diminished because of mind wandering. So you are not seeing sights as clearly, you are not hearing sounds as clearly, you are missing what's happening in your environment because of mind wandering. Now you can already imagine, like, that's not good news for a football player or a soldier to not see what's happening, or a student really for that matter. You want to avoid perceptual decoupling when you want to fully be able to absorb what's happening around you to influence your performance. And of course, there's a kind of a famous paper written by colleagues at Harvard, a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. We know that there's a correspondence between poor mood and mind wandering. So that's kind of the landscape of what I mean by mind wandering. It's got all of these features. And the other key feature is that mind wandering is problematic and leads to all these things, specifically when it's unintentional and it happens without our awareness. So that means that think of the last time that you were reading a newspaper article or something online and you got to the bottom and you're like, no idea what it says, right? Start over again. No idea what it says. Start over again. So we know what this experience is. And we're not intending to be mind wandering. We just kind of land there. And when that happens is when these become most problematic. Now, this discussion we had at lunch I thought was really good. It was basically saying, well, isn't it sometimes good to just let your mind wander? I think I have some of my best ideas when I'm like taking a walk or in the shower enjoying the hot shower. Sure, that's not what I would call mind wandering. That's what I call daydreaming, or in psychology speak, constructive internal reflection, right? The key difference between mind wandering and constructive internal reflection is this intentionality and awareness dimension. When you are having a nice walk through the park, you are intending to allow the free flow of conscious thought to come through you. You're not constraining your task to something that you're trying to achieve and that mind wandering is happening. You're just letting it happen. And when that happens, it actually is very beneficial. Now, there's now several studies that have attributed daydreaming, or this allowing of the mind to flow, with creative problem solving, successful creative problem solving, with more aha moments of insight as you're trying to solve a problem. Better planning for the future, more insight. And when you have these visioning moments, it's not catastrophic visioning, but actually positive visioning that allows for success in what you're trying to achieve. So I'm all for this. The key is that you're doing it with awareness. And the problematic side is when we don't do it with awareness. So now going back to this unintentional and without awareness, the issue is that mind wandering, that wandering mind, is driven more by stress. So that under stress, we're not simply just rewinding the mind to reflect on the past, but when we're in the past, we are ruminating, reliving, regretting experiences or memories that have already happened. Or when we're planning for the future, pressing fast forward, we're not just planning for the future, actually. We're experiencing the future with catastrophizing and worrying, not just about, something that, we're catastrophizing and worrying about things that just haven't even happened yet, but they may never even happen. They may never happen. We made them up, right? So kind of ricocheting back and forth between these, and this is sort of a prominent feature of many psychological illnesses, PTSD foremost among them. This notion of a memory that kind of traps you in the past, so that you're rubbernecking to this memory that's happened, landing there frequently and even without your control. It's very problematic. So again, the question we had, if stress and protracted periods of stress increase this mental time travel in a dysfunctional manner, maybe if we can offer mindfulness training, we can provide more opportunities for them to keep that button on play and benefit in their attention. So now let's move from kind of the theoretical or the broad kind of background on mindfulness to really what we bring to the lab, right? So our question was whether we could offer mindfulness training to these high-stress groups and see if it would have any impact on mind wandering. But one of the puzzles of doing that was how we're going to assess that in the laboratory. How are we actually going to assess mind wandering? Because as I just said, the key to mind wandering is that it's unintentional and without awareness. So we can't simply bring participants in and say, okay, now mind wander, right? Because if we did that, they're like doing what we said. They're not mind wandering. They're actually satisfying the task requirements. So we puzzled over this for quite a while. And what we realized is that, here's all you have to do to make people mind wander. Like, just bore them, right? If you bore people, they will happily mind wander. Their mind is much more entertaining than the boring content that you're providing. This is always my danger spot where I'm like, I hope not a lot of mind wandering right now. Okay, so that's what led us to really this task that now many people are using, which I would still say is one of the world's most boring tasks, the sustained attention response task. And what happens in this task is that you see a digit appear, in our case, about one every half second or so. And your job is to just press a button every time you see that digit appear. Pretty boring, right? The only thing interesting is that every now and then, about 5% of the time, that digit will be 3, in which case you should not press the button. You should withhold a response. So pretty soon, people are going along, they're pressing the button, it's getting really boring, they start mind wandering, the 3 appears, and they get that, oh crap, they pressed to the 3. And that happens pretty reliably, and I've never seen such big, buff, brawny guys get so dysregulated by seeing a 3 on the screen, but it happens. They really get angry that they can't withhold a simple, very apparent. It's not like the 3 was tricky to see, right? Right there. They couldn't see it. They were mind wandering. So in addition to looking at their performance, which is how well do they withhold to the 3, and how well do they use their button press in a good, reliable way to press to all the other digits. So we can look at accuracy. We can look at response time. We also stop the experiment every now and then and just ask them, how on task were you? Were you on task or were you totally off task? And how aware are you of where your attention is? Are you aware that you were mind wandering? Or did this kind of question prompt you to say, oh yeah, I was mind wandering, right? So this task allows us a window in to the consequences of mind wandering on performance, but also as a way in which we can see if mindfulness training might help curb mind wandering. And so the specific things that we're going to look at is what's your accuracy on this task? How well are you pressing when you should, not pressing when you shouldn't? What is your response time? And what we know is that when people are much more variable in their response time, they're mind wandering. So we just look at the variability and the regularity with which they're pressing the button. And then we can look at the responses to these probe questions. What are they saying? Are they saying they're on task or off task? I wanted to just mention, because a lot of times when I describe this SART, people are like, yeah, that's great, but that doesn't have to do with anything in the real world. I mean, button digits on a screen. But actually it does. So it ends up that your performance on the SART, on this task, corresponds with PTSD scores, with depression scores, and even sleep quality. People have related it to all 3 of these, which I think makes it a reliable complement to a lot of subjective reports that people give. And I think that that's also why it could be of interest to the kind of populations that we are working with. All right, so let's dig in. So we now know what the task is that we'll use. You get a basic understanding of what I'm trying to achieve here. The first group of participants that I'd like to share with you is a group of students, and we tracked their attention. We gave them this SART task in the sort of the middle of the semester, and then 7 weeks later, toward the end of the semester when they were nearing finals. And we want to see what happens to their attention. So just to set out what we did, we published this paper a few years back, is we're going to have one group, like I just said, that are experiencing, they're experiencing actually 2 groups that we're going to test during the academic semester, right, at the beginning and then nearing finals. The other group is another control group that we don't offer this to during the academic semester. We actually tested them during the summer. So they were demographically matched with the other groups, but they weren't in a high stress period. I mean, self-described as not high stress. So our question was really, well, first pass, what happens as a function of mindfulness training? Is there a benefit? But we really have to couch this in terms of what happens as a function of the academic semester in general. Right? And to know that, we want to compare the academic semester to the outside of the academic semester. So actually, before I tell you about the results, let me just tell you a little bit about the training, because this is some of the interesting conversations we had today is how do you make training accessible to a high-stress academic group, whether that's undergrads or medical students, right, or residents. I mean, people that are really focused on getting the job done right, they want to put all their time and energy into it, but we still want to introduce mindfulness because our hunch is that their attention is going to be vulnerable over this high stress period of time. So what we did in this study is we actually, undergrads come to our building 3 times a week for most of their classes. They had a required freshman course that met multiple times a week. So what we said is, okay, before you come to class 3 times a week, just come in and see us 20 minutes before that. 1 day a week, they met with the instructor and got the basic content. Then 2 other times a week, they came into the lab and just listened to headphones of guided practices. They were also given the opportunity to do the practices outside of that context if they wanted to. Most of them didn't take us up on it. Right? So that's really low time demands, an hour a week for 7 weeks. And we really thought this might be too low for time demands. What we liked about it is that we had they were a kind of a good group because they were already there. They could come a little bit earlier. We didn't have to have them do anything special, really. They just showed up at the building and they did this thing. And we gave them all kinds of practices. Really, the primary ones, though, were the mindful breathing one that we went over and the body scan, because we wanted them to sit upright and just kind of follow through with the guided instructions. So our questions, the first pass question is, what happens as a function of, forget mindfulness yet, though I'll talk about that in a minute, what happens to attention, to SART performance, as a function of just going through the academic semester? Right? What happens to accuracy, RT variability, and probe response? So the first data point I'm going to show you is what happens to this group that did not get the SART during the academic semester. They got it over the summer. And what we see is that this task is quite stable. So 2 weeks apart, the accuracy scores don't significantly differ. They were tested outside the academic semester, which gave us confidence that this is a stable task. If life is pretty steady, you're going to be steady in your performance of it. And the next thing we wanted to see is now what happens if you give a control group the same task during the last 7 weeks of the semester. And the news wasn't so good there. They significantly declined in their attention, which matched perfectly with the subjective descriptions that we had from many studies studying the effect of the academic semester on well-being. Right? Like all those things I said, poor mood, higher stress levels, risky behaviors, poor eating habits. Like the whole profile is like things aren't as good as they used to be. You're not following through in the way you used to, and that's what happens with attention. And I'm just giving you the graph of the accuracy here, but actually all 3 of these dimensions showed we saw worse accuracy, higher variability, and the probe responses, they self-reported being more off-task in the semester versus not in the semester. So this leads us to the next question, which is, well, what happens as a function of the what happens as a function of mindfulness training? If degradation is what happens with nothing, can we protect against that? And that's what we found. We found that mindfulness not only kept them stable, but when we did the test, it was actually significantly small, but significantly greater than where they started out. So that, to our mind, was very promising. It suggested that you can offer training. It's feasible to offer training during this window. They liked it. They did it because it was very low time demands, and they benefited. And again, the full profile is their accuracy improved, their RT variability went down, and we actually didn't see any change over time. There was no increase in their self-report of being off task. So this gives us a window into the sort of objective and subjective account of mind wandering for this population as a function of mindfulness training. So that was our very first study that we did on this, with this question in mind, looking at the high stress period of the academic semester. But you might be saying to yourself, well, that's great, very encouraging, but there's some problems with your study. At least it's quite limited. You very few people that got the mindfulness training. And I'd agree. We got the people that would agree to come to our training. You don't have an active comparison. You're comparing something to nothing. Sure, the academic semester may be a problem, but maybe if you gave them massages every week, they'd also show this great improvement in their well-being. And they didn't have to do much on their own. And maybe if you allowed them to kind of invest on their own with their own practice, you could even see improvement beyond this, beyond what you're showing. So that I agree with all those criticisms. That actually led us to the next group I'd like to tell you about, the group of athletes that we've worked with, who are student athletes. This is actually called the Cane Brain Project because we're the Hurricanes, the Miami Hurricanes. And we advertised this as really a mental conditioning program. We didn't introduce it as a mindfulness training program. My graduate student is actually a former football player. He played for Northwestern all 4 years, so he was our window into this world. I mean, I'm not a football player. I don't know if you could tell, but I'm not a football player. And I certainly had no understanding of what the challenges are and what the kind of nature is of demand that you experience as a student athlete, especially a student football player. So we had to pick when in time we were going to do this, and he suggested we pick right at the month prior to their preseason camps. The camps, apparently, before the season begins, determine basically your fate during the season, if you're going to get to play or not, what position you'll play, your kind of where you fall in the hierarchy of the football team. They're also in classes for this month, so we already had a hunch that the academic demands are going to cause a decline. They're physically training really hard during this month. So our prediction was that this high demand period of time would lead to degradation in their performance if we did nothing at all, right? And we actually are very happy, just this week the paper came out. So if you'd like to read it, you're welcome to do so. It's an open access article. All right, so this time we were able to get the entire team to at least be open to doing this. We divided up the cohorts into a mindfulness training group, and we compared them to a relaxation training group. And the reason we chose relaxation is because, they're still my hurricanes, right? I mean, I don't want to put them through a training that I thought was bogus or would harm them, or I don't want their football careers to die because I put them through a bad training. Relaxation and visualization are very commonly practiced sports psychology programs that benefit people. So we wanted to use something that we thought, at least from the existing literature, would be beneficial. So we offered them the mindfulness training or the relaxation training. We tested them twice, and let me tell you a little bit about how we conducted the program. We called the whole umbrella program mindfulness and relaxation, so they were kind of unsure which of the two programs they were getting. They knew they were getting something kind of in this larger rubric of these topics. And what we did is we saw them 4 days a week. 1 day a week we had the class with them, but one of the class day and 3 other days a week, we got them for just the last 15 minutes of weight training. And we basically introduced something called what we called like a mindful cool down, where they would listen. You could see someone hanging out and listening there. They're sitting there with earbuds in, listening to a guided practice. Now, they were all together, but the practices they got differed based on the group that they were in. And they did this with regularity. We not only had them tell us how much practice they did, we obviously saw who was at the proctored sessions versus not, but we also had them tell us if they practiced in addition to this outside of the normal time period. So what was our prediction going into this? Our prediction was, now everybody's practicing something, and potentially both programs could be beneficial, right? But maybe it's the case that how much practice they engaged in would tell us about the level of benefit. So maybe those with low practice, or basically very little engagement, they might show up to class and kind of sit there, but very little self-guided practice outside of the scope of what was required of them, and maybe even low engagement when they sat there with the earbuds in. Low practice should probably result in a decrease in well-being over this period of time. And high practice may keep them steady. This was our if nothing else goes well, maybe we'll see this, right? Of course, we wanted to see if they could benefit beyond that. But in addition to looking at, this is talking about our predictions of well-being. In addition to well-being, obviously, we were going to look at attention also. So I'm going to show you next is the results from the SART task. We're using a signal detection measure, but think of it as similar to accuracy. And I'm going to show you the results for the mindfulness training group, right? We had mindfulness and relaxation. Mindfulness training group at the beginning of the 4 weeks and at the end, and what happens as a function of practice. The group that had low practice significantly declined, and the group that had high practice stayed stable. Now I'm kind of showing you this just for kind of illustration purposes, but the way we did the analysis actually wasn't just median split like this. We actually did structural equation modeling and were able to track people over whatever their practice level was. But I think this does capture well what's going on. If we do nothing at all, meaning if they do nothing at all or very little, they decline, but we can protect against this. The key was what happens to the other group, because maybe engaging in anything would be protective, right? So what I'm going to show you next is what happens when we take those that practice the most in both groups, high mindfulness practice and high relaxation practice. And here's what we get. Right? So high mindfulness practice, they stayed pretty steady, as I just showed you, but high relaxation practice, they significantly declined. So this to us was pretty interesting, because it's suggesting that it's not just engaging in anything at all. The more you engage in something, the more you might benefit, but if you engage in relaxation training, you're not going to benefit your attention. One other thing I'll mention is that it was the case that relaxation was beneficial. When we look at high relaxation and high mindfulness versus low relaxation and low mindfulness training, we find that the entire high practice group, regardless of which program, benefited in their psychological well-being. They've reported being less stressed, more positive mood, less anxious. So their well-being really was supported by more practice regardless of the group. But attention was only benefited by mindfulness training. So in some sense, if you're going to do one thing, probably you should do mindfulness training because you get the psychological health benefits as well as the attentional benefits. So to kind of bring us back, because I'm about to wrap up soon here, what do we find as a function of high stress? Attention declines. And what about mindfulness training? Can it be helpful? Yes, it seems to be helpful, but practicing is actually key. If you don't engage in the formal practice, if you just show up, you're not going to benefit. So the last few minutes, I want to just share with you what we've been doing with active duty military personnel, because in addition to the two groups that I just described to you, there are many other groups that suffer from high stress periods of time. And we want to figure out how it is that we can offer the training that might benefit, kind of broadly speaking. And the military context is a pretty compelling one. The military has really been interested in mindfulness training, really from the point of view of what happens post-deployment. Most recently, Military Medicine, one of the premier journals in how the military sort of guides people on best practices, suggested that mindfulness-based interventions are useful, right? But this is mostly in the VA context. People are coming back, they're not going through the deployment cycle over and over again. But there's positive support that it's beneficial as an adjunctive therapy, especially with regard to PTSD. So I wanted to just say that's, I think, a good thing. And there's many studies, 52 studies that they aggregated to look at this. But my interest really wasn't in that you're done with deployment and now you're integrating into civilian life. It was for those people for whom attention mattered, not just because it was going to be challenged, but because then they had to be deployed. Then they had to be actors with whatever mental state they had. So what we did, because we wanted to make this a reasonable to do study, is that we actually engaged people during either intensive field training or pre-deployment training. So this is the period of time of, again, 2 to 3 months in which they are preparing to be deployed. And for most of them, as I said, 3 to 5 prior deployments. It's not the first time that they're doing this. And what we wanted to find out first and foremost is what happens to people over this, let's say, 2-month interval of pre-deployment training. Because not only are they preparing to go to a war zone, but they're preparing to leave loved ones behind, and they're having to prepare for all of these operational skills they need to go be able to do whatever mission they've been assigned to do, right? Hunch was high demand period of time, attention may be compromised. And there has already been a lot of research suggesting well-being declines for service members during the pre-deployment interval. And that's what we found. We found that over 9 weeks that we looked at the SART performance, there was a significant decline for people when we do nothing at all. So they haven't received mindfulness training, they decline. So the question, again, very similar to the ones we've already asked, can mindfulness training promote resilience in this type of a cohort, in this pre-deployment training period? And I'm not going to have time to tell you everything, but I will tell you that we published several studies on it. And overall, the results are quite promising with regard to pre-deployment Marines as well as pre-deployment Army service members. And we've now expanded our work to looking at the spouses of military service members as well. So going back to best practices, the way in which we've gone about doing this work is by systematically, all these different points. Through a series of studies, we've now basically systematically manipulated all the different training requirements. So what happens if you offer 24 hours of training? Does it differ from when you offer 16 hours? And then can you go down to 8 hours? Because the challenge is always going to be there's never enough time to offer the training. If we could find beneficial effects with as low as 8 hours, maybe that's a place to start for people, right? To get the introduction in a way that is beneficial, not a waste of their time. So what we're at now is with a program called Mindfulness-Based Attention Training, we're able to successfully find that 4 weeks of offering them training, about 2 hours a week, so 8 hours total, results in these same benefits for attention and working memory. But what we had to do, because we had to cut so much time, is make sure that we really stayed to only those aspects of the program that would benefit them. So we essentially cut most of the didactic information. I mean, again, if you went to a gym, I think I might have said this, but if you go to a gym and you've got a personal trainer, do you want them to talk to you about how great exercises or just do the reps with you, right? It's just engaging in the practices is what seemed to be key. And that's where we saw the benefits. The other thing we're doing now is we're looking at what kind of trainer to have. Should we have somebody that has embodied first-person experience of mindfulness, or can we train people up that know a lot about what it means to be a service member and have success with that? And what we're finding is that Army sports psychologists who don't really know a lot about mindfulness but get a 10-week introduction and primer to learn mindfulness for themselves and then go to deliver the mindfulness training to soldiers, they're able to benefit soldier performance. Actually much more than an MBSR instructor delivering it. So I know I'm going kind of fast with this, but I do want to give you a sense that we've taken this systematic strategy to really be able to answer questions with regard to what we can offer people. And we're finding that it's actually quite beneficial. But everything I've showed you so far is really kind of objective data, in the laboratory, a little bit sterile. I wanted to just leave you with a quote by one of the people that went through our program. So he received our mindfulness training at pre-deployment, and then he was actually deployed, and we talked to him after he came back to ask him what was his experience like having had this program prior to his deployment. I'm just going to read it to you. So during my previous deployment, especially after doing multiple missions and being up late, I would go out on missions, I would be so jittery, so fragmented, so ready to pull the trigger, so ready to kill. Without any hesitation, I was ready to go bloodthirsty, so amped, there was no control, and thank God nothing happened. This time, I was focused. I was watching things. I was much more attentive to the people who were around me and what they were doing. Before, it was a blur. So I think that the compelling part of this is the transformation you see, and the terrifying part is what he was like before. Because right now, only a handful of our service members, in the hundreds, have received this training. And many of them are likely to be in the first part of this quote. So for me, this is real motivation to figure out best practices to offer it to people. Because frankly, whether I like it or not, we live in a country that has a military, and that military is often asked, because our policymakers decide this to be the case, our government officials decide this to be a case, they're asked to be in military combat. And when they're asked to do this repeatedly, 3 to 5 times, there are consequences. And if there's anything we can do when we put people in these circumstances to protect against the psychological disorders that will sure come as a function of doing this, I think it's at least some part of our responsibility, our collective responsibility as a society who has this military, to offer something that can benefit them. So I just want to end with sort of the broader conclusions, right? So what have we found to date? Well, first, my plea, please keep doing more research. We need a lot more before we can all raise our hands and say, of course, mindfulness training is helpful, right? We're not quite there yet as a culture, as a society. But to date, we have positive support that mindfulness training can improve attention. It can protect against attentional lapses that happen over high stress periods of time. And we see this in a variety of groups, from students, athletes, to service members, and many other populations that we've worked with. The other thing that's really important is that we can offer it in shorter doses. So maybe we can even broaden the scope of who gets it and what benefits might come. So 7 to 8 hours of training over 4 to 7 weeks, we see benefits. But the key in all of this, it's not just offering the program, is daily practice. If they do some commitment to a certain period of formal practice, in particular a stillness practice, daily, they'll see benefits. So I think that just the broad conclusion is that I think we need to keep investigating this, because there's no lack of high-stress groups in our society, including all of us. So I'll just end by saying thank you for your attention. All right, do we have any questions, or, yeah?
So classic MBCT and MBSR have about 50% of their time allocated to focused attention and about 50% to open monitoring. And I was wondering, with your program, you kept that ratio. It sounded like breath awareness was definitely a major practice. Was that the only practice?
No, it was not the only practice. It was the through line through all 4 weeks. So the mindfulness of breathing was a foundational exercise we asked them to do throughout. About week 3, we introduced open monitoring, and that becomes added to it. And then the last week is actually a connection, or what you might call loving kindness or compassion practice. So it is a hybrid program. There are multiple elements, but absolutely it is the case that the concentrated practice is the most prominent of what they're to practice on their own. Anyone else? Yes.
Do you work with kindness practice with the military?
Well, that's what I was saying. The last week is a connection and kindness practice. With our work, and I was kind of like, we got to make sure we frame it the right way. So a lot of that framing came from the kindness and concern and heart they have toward their own battle buddy, right? So they understand that. So our practices would guide, or teammate in the case of the football players. So they understood that they have a real concern for the people closest to them, that they want to work well with them. And then part of the exercise is to kind of expand out beyond that. But it's one of many components of the training. In the work we're doing with military spouses, that I thought was my real opportunity to really grow the compassion component. So our military spouse program is much more equal mindfulness and compassion. So it's got both elements. So we'll see what happens. I mean, so far it looks like it really is beneficial to military spouses.
For the military, it might turn them into pacifists.
Might. Hey, we'll see what happens. Yes.
Can you explain a little bit about reaction time reliability and what that means if it's increasing? Decreasing?
Sure.
And
So
is there any results on the second studies about it? The second or third study?
the second study with the student athletes also found ICV decreased with mindfulness practice. Yeah, the paper, I didn't want to be exhaustive about it, but the paper will show you that. So RT variability is really just looking at the mean RT, the mean RT over the standard deviation of the RT. So that's what we mean by variability.
I know how to calculate it, but how would you interpret it?
So the interpretation is that the higher the variability corresponds to more self-reported mind wandering. So these are studies that kind of preceded ours, in which they looked just in the period of time before they reported their own mind wandering, and to see what the variability was. And they always found that the higher reports of mind wandering corresponded to more variability in that window. And it also was the case that when their objective performance was when they made an error, right, when they pressed the button when they shouldn't have, RT variability was higher right around that window. That's what led us to say, okay, maybe we trust that when there's high variability, there may be it may be an objective counterpart to the subjective experience of mind wandering. That's our best guess right now. So the kind of studies we're doing now is to look to see what perceptual decoupling looks like. You know, how does the brain respond in these intervals, to see if it is the case that we're seeing a reduction in the input that's coming in during those periods of high ICV. Does that answer your question? What's the problem?
Yeah, I just wonder what it really means on an intentional level. So if your reaction time varies, I do the same measurement, but I just want to hear what your idea
Yeah,
are.
I mean, at this point, I'm really leaning on the broader literature, right? I'm leaning on the literature that suggests what the performance and the self-report consequences of it. And if you find it unsatisfactory, I'd say, I agree with you, but there's a lot more that could be done on it. It shows reliable change over as a function of stress. It goes up, and as a function of mindfulness training, it tends to go down. Yes?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for your presentation. It's fascinating to hear about your work, and I applaud you for your efforts. Something about the language bothers me at certain moments. I have no hostility to mindfulness training, but I do want to say this. When, and you mentioned at the end of your talk, all of us are essentially under duress, right? So picking up from that, I would want to ask you to talk more about how you think mindfulness could link to movements for justice. In this sense, right? Because sometimes I hear this mindfulness language as venerating and reifying like values of the popular culture, of dominant culture, right? Values around quietude, and that the mind is the seat of being, right? That should be cultivated in these kinds of very gentle ways, you know. And my sense is that may not, I mean, when I think about in particular PTSD, in things like exposure therapy or psychomotor therapy, like ways in which the body has to be centered, and that sometimes being loud and screaming and doing things that are kind of radically different than when we say mindfulness, because you had it linked to non-emotional reactivity, right? I get concerned that there's almost a fear of bodily and highly emotionally expressive means towards things like, you call it attention, but I'll say things like honing in, wait, maybe I should say on things like being focused enough on what's going on in the moment, in the present moment, enough to say it must stop.
Right.
So just speak to that more, because
Sure.
I would love to hear it.
Well, I think that, yeah, I mean, in no way is what I'm saying that the mindfulness practice would lead to a disengaged inactor. Inactor meaning somebody that's just not going to respond. What our hope is that engaging in these practices, and this, especially this issue with regard to non-reactivity, and this is a common kind of concept within the mindfulness world, is that it's a response relative versus a reaction, right? So going back to the soldier example, it's not the case that we think that being more present to what's happening around you will make you unwilling to engage at all. It may be the case that, in fact, this is what we're seeing, is that when you do engage, you're doing it with certainty and with discernment. So that when you are saying, this must stop, or I must stop, there is an awareness of doing it that isn't coming through some autopilot. It's not coming through some implicit processing that you have no awareness of. So it's absolutely not the case. So you might be thinking that, well, you know, with the 3, it's like, okay, don't press the button, right? But and in many cases, reactivity leads to what we call errors of commission, action when you don't want to be committing it, or action that is the wrong action. So you want to be committing an action, but it's not the right one. So the intention here is to promote more awareness of your behavior, so that when you do behave, it's in line with your ethical code, it's in line with your understanding of what's required of the situation, and it's done with a confidence that says, I'm fully aware of what's going into this decision. Yeah.
Do you find that some people are sort of more naturally inclined to take to mindfulness? And do those people have other characteristics where you can sort of spot somebody when they come into your lab and say, oh, that one's they're gonna take to this, or not?
Yeah, you know, I think that's a great question, right? So are there like some, can you profile a person? Like, I see it, mindfulness guy. You know, it kind of surprises me. The one consistent, we looked at this in our soldier population, like who was it that ended, actually it was the first study, the Marine study. Who is it that ends up practicing? Because the more they practiced, the more they benefited. And we did like a bunch of personality questions. We asked them about their deployment history, you know, personal history, as much as we could. And what we found is that the common feature of people that ended up practicing on their own during the initial training was openness to new experiences. But the close second was prior deployments. Right? So they know what's going to happen, and they know what doesn't work. So now when you're open and you have a lot of prior experience, you may become open to it. But what surprised me is that we definitely had resistors, people that, you know, you could see on their face, they don't give a crap about what I'm saying, and they really don't want to be here. Right? That's not hard to spot. Many of the people that experienced that and actually didn't practice during the training, I was talking about this earlier with some of the students, what happened was that when they were actually deployed, they actually changed their tune, because they were realizing, oh, those guys that weren't the resistors, they're sleeping through the night. They're not having, you know, a physical response. They're not shaking after they come back from being on patrol or being in a battle. And maybe I want some of that. So sometimes the openness to trying it out comes from seeing the benefits that others are getting that you aren't getting because you chose to resist. And thankfully, a lot of those people that started noticing that and that were our initial uninterested people began to practice even while they were deployed. So I think that we don't have a precise formula yet, and I think experience may also shift that. Yeah.
So I want to just preface this by saying I don't know much about this field, but I was really fascinated by when you were talking about how well-being diminishes for students, athletes, and service members over a certain interval. And I guess, tell me if you think this question is unfair, but it seems to me like a lot of the focus is on looking at this macro period of time and saying if you take students, once they go through the semester, their well-being diminishes, their attention diminishes. And to remedy that, the focus is on developing these mindfulness practices that they can do to improve their well-being attention, right? So did you or anyone in this field find specific instances on like a micro level throughout the semester that cause the well-being of students to diminish? And like if those findings exist, is there any effort to actually change like what is being taught to students and change the experience? Like, I don't really know how this would apply to soldiers because you can't construct a
I
war.
think, yeah.
Like,
No, I don't think it's an unfair question. And I think it's very much in line with the question that maybe was asked earlier. Like in some way, are we just brushing the problem under the rug by just applying mindfulness as like, oh, now you're happy. So all the reasons that you weren't happy have gone away. I don't think that that's the case. I mean, what ends up happening, especially you see this in workplace settings, when people are in high stress in the workplace context, probably the most well-studied, what happens as a function of getting mindfulness training is more problem solving to change the factors that led to that. It's like, look, the problem isn't just that I'm overworked, it's that the policies that allow my boss to do that to me are a problem. So getting in this action problem solving mode, they seem to have more capacity to do that. Now, how do you change the academic semester and the way it's organized? I mean, I think that we're just at the beginning stages, but I actually gave a similar lecture at Middlebury, and it ended up the president of Middlebury was in the audience. And when that person hears what's happening, her first thought was like, how could we reorganize the way that finals are done so that people aren't having to take finals during the most vulnerable period of time if they're kind of drained through the semester? So those lead to, so it's not just the individuals experiencing it, but the leadership that understands the consequences and the goodwill they need to have pushed by the people that are actually benefiting and suffering to make the change. But I still would say the same thing I said to him, which is that the core capacity to problem solve has to be present in order to engage effectively to result in the systematic change. And actually, one of the projects that I want to work on coming up is what is the cost of activism, environmental activism, political activism, on attention and mood. Because if you want to really act in a way that benefits society and allow your point of view to be heard, but you're depleted, you're not going to be as skillful at doing that. So I think this is a broader issue, but it goes to your point of it's not simply now you're happy, no problem, I'll go through the semester as it is. You may change the way you operate. You may demand things differently. And I think that's where the power for change exists. But without attentional resources to even engage in those problem-solving skills, I think you're out of luck. Yeah, I think, oh, sorry. You go first, then last question, I think. We're already at 7.
So I'm just wondering, based on your research, do you think that there's an age range for the effectiveness of mindfulness training? I'm thinking about students in maybe the K-12 setting whose attentional resources may be growing through development, but are just experiencing really high stressful situations, especially as they, develop into high school.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a big mindfulness and education movement in which people are being offered mindfulness training really from pre-K on. And the results are actually interesting, right? They're positive so far, but again, we have the positivity bias, so I'm going to put quotes around positive. So more research is definitely needed. The key difference between, I think that so far from our work, from the larger literature, young children can benefit, adults can benefit, older adults can benefit. But the key difference tends to be the way in which the programs are offered and the components and the demands on how much they practice. Right? So, and that's true for not just across age, but across different types of populations. So an ADHD participant may not benefit from the same program that somebody that doesn't have ADHD would. So there has to be both considerations of how it's offered to see if the program is beneficial to that. You can't apply the same program to everybody and expect the same benefits. Yes?
So one of the things to speak to your question about mindfulness, your question about mindfulness and quietude, I think it's a real common misconception, and I also think within the mindfulness community itself. The goal of mindfulness isn't to make a quiet, better cogs in the wheel. That isn't the goal at all. And what you were speaking to about Middlebury. I mean, if you just look back from a socio-political and historical point of view, if you look back at Martin King, you look back at Gandhi, those movements were very much rooted in deep attention and practice of paying attention to intention. And was nothing about any of that that was quiet.
Right.
It was intentional, it was reflective, and it was very much about problem solving. And I think one of the worries, at least to me, in the practice of mindfulness and bringing this to medicine, is the whole idea around it being co-opted to create better toxin meals. And in my perspective, in offering this, it is so not about that. It is really about how do we engage with intention in change, really radical and deep change, but in ways that are productive and constructive and maybe hurt, but also with that deeper intention about shifting culture.
Absolutely.
Okay, can I respond to that?
Yes.
Okay.
I know I'm speaking for you.
Yeah. So then what about Malcolm or somebody like Noble Drew Ali, who would say, well, yeah, white people can get behind what they think is intentional, which somehow reflects their approach and doesn't sort of put it in their face. But a movement like Malcolm X and even Farrakhan or Elijah Muhammad and Noble Drew Ali, who are in your face with it and say, no, you are the devil, is another way of doing therapy for those who are catching a certain kind of hell that allows them to be expressive in ways that is self-protective and self-caring, but not mindful, and therefore it's a mode of surviving, right? Both rhetorically and spiritually, but that doesn't sort of venerate the kind of intentionality that
I would say there's nothing exclusive there in terms of paying attention. You can be loud and paying attention. You can be loud, you can be in your face, you can be all of those things you just said.
Well, but you
And
said intentionality, though.
Hmm?
You said intentionality was behind Martin's movement, which you linked to Gandhi and I think to Kahan.
Do we know what Malcolm X's inner life was? Did he have a contemplative practice?
Well, certainly he was a Sunni Muslim in the final years of his life, but I think it's difficult to say what anybody's interior life is because you're not there, right?
Right.
So I'm not sure.
So, I think what's interesting for me, just to kind of break, is that the groups that I work with, in every respect, they would be the loud, reactive, boisterous groups, right? Whether you're talking about service members or first responders or football players or whatever, activists now with another group that I want to work with. Like, these are people that you not think of them as the quiet types that sit in the corner. And the response that they're showing to these programs is a better ability to behave in a way that aligns with them. It has nothing to do with quiet. It has to do with their ability to engage in a way that aligns with the way they want to be acting. So I think we can have a longer conversation about the biases that exist in the framing of what acceptable behavior is, but that's certainly outside the scope of what this attention researcher can say with authority. But I wanted to put it out there that with the groups that we've been working with, which most people would say you're nuts to offer it to them. They're not going to even listen to you. But we've had results that suggest that it's beneficial to them, and they certainly haven't got less boisterous as a function of it, but they do feel more aligned where their behavior is matching the way they want to be in the world. So, all right, I think I have to end there. Let me talk to you offline. Thank you.